Imagine a Viking, an axe in his hand, a village burning behind him. Now picture that same man, clad in imperial armor, standing motionless at the gates of the palace in Constantinople. These aren't two different worlds, it's one and the same career. How did a culture built on plunder and freedom give rise to the most incorruptible bodyguards in history? They journeyed to Miklagard, the city of gold and poison, where betrayal was the norm and an emperor's life was cheap. Yet these northern barbarians, whom the Byzantines called pelikiphoroi, the axe-bearing guard, were valued by emperors above their own nobility. What compelled them to become the empire's last line of defense? The answer lies in how Byzantium hacked their barbarian code of honor, transforming greed into an unbreakable loyalty. But this enigma runs deeper than it appears, concealing two intractable questions. First, why did the oath of a pagan foreigner prove stronger than the allegiance of an educated Byzantine aristocrat? The nobility possessed everything, faith, wealth, status, yet constantly plotted conspiracies. The second question is even stranger. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the descendants of Vikings, the Normans, annihilated the Anglo-Saxon army. What did the exiled Anglo-Saxon aristocrats do? They flocked en masse to Constantinople to join the Varangian Guard, standing shoulder to shoulder with the descendants of their enemies. What drove people who had lost their homeland to Vikings to serve a foreign emperor alongside them? The answers to these questions are the 7 keys to the Varangian Guard's code: cultural, economic, military, political, and even personal. In a few moments, you'll discover how the empire's first enemies, who once burned its cities, became its most coveted mercenaries. In the 9th century, Rus ships burned the suburbs of Constantinople. By the 10th century, those same Rus stood on its walls as elite defenders. How did the number one threat become the number one protector? Byzantium always hired barbarians. It was standard practice. But with the Rus, it was different. Their primary value wasn't their strength, but their foreignness. They had no families, no lands, and no political ambitions within the empire. They were immune to the poison of court intrigues. The emperors were the first to understand the managed greed of a foreigner was safer than the unpredictable treachery of an aristocrat. They saw not chaos and barbarian fury, but a tool, and decided to channel this torrent into a safe course. But how? An empire capable of fielding a massive army systematically paid tribute and forged contracts with those it seemingly could have crushed. This was not weakness, but strategy. Byzantium didn't merely hire foederati to guard its borders, as Rome had done. It deliberately channeled the threat. Instead of fighting the Rus at the capital's walls, it offered them contracts in distant provinces: Syria, Italy, the Caucasus. Entire war bands were redirected from the north to the east. In this way, the empire bought 3 things: the capital's security, time, and crucially, the opportunity to study the psychology of its future elite soldiers. Would you dare to hire your bitterest enemy for protection? For free Scandinavian warriors, this was no humiliation. It was the pinnacle of their careers. In their sagas, Constantinople, Miklagard, was a great city, a mythical place of gold and wonders. Service there was not just a means of enrichment, but the most prestigious social ladder. A warrior returning from Miklagard gained immense status and could become a chieftain. It was a well-planned career, an entire industry. The evidence is carved in stone. Runic inscriptions across Sweden declare, "He fell in the east, in the host." These were not mere epitaphs. They were public resumes, testimonies of supreme achievement. For now, it was the dream of individuals, but soon it would become official policy. How did scattered mercenary detachments evolve into a permanent elite corps? Until the late 10th century, the Rus were just one of many, effective but not unique. Everything changed with one man and one crisis. Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, was on the brink of ruin. His best general, Bardas Phocas, had rebelled against him. The nobility and army were betraying him en masse. Surrounded by enemies in his own palace, Basil made a revolutionary decision. He needed a weapon whose loyalty did not depend on Byzantine politics, a weapon that could not be bribed because it was foreign, and he knew where to find it. His only chance for salvation, 6,000 warriors from Kiev, was already sailing toward him from the north. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary political alliance. Kievan Prince Vladimir marries the emperor's sister, Anna, and in return sends 6,000 warriors to aid Basil in a civil war. But the numbers dismantle this simple picture. 6,000 warriors was not just a detachment by 10th century standards. It was an entire army, capable of single-handedly deciding the outcome of a war. Basil wasn't asking for help. He was importing a new personal army because he no longer trusted his old one. And their first task was not to fight an external enemy, but to make a decisive example of the rebellious Byzantine regiments. This act defined their primary function for a century to come. But how could such a small group control a capital of 1 million people? The answer lay in their placement. The Varangians were not merely bodyguards. They were guardians of access to power. They accompanied the emperor everywhere, in the palace, at church, on the battlefield. No conspirator could reach the ruler without passing through a wall of axes. This rendered any bribery of officials and generals worthless. The guard was not just a wall, but the sole key to the lock leading to the emperor, and only they held that key. Thus, the Varangian guard became a state within a state, its loyalty directed not to the empire, but to the specific person on the throne. At night, they slept with weapons in hand, right in the imperial chambers. But for this system to work, not only physical, but also psychological mechanisms of loyalty were needed. Maintaining such a unit was justified not only by protection. They were used as a universal instrument of power. Yes, they were the shock troops in Basil II's wars against the Bulgars, earning him the moniker Bulgar Slayer. But their covert functions were more important. They were sent to rebellious provinces to collect taxes because they could not be bribed. Noble aristocrats suspected of treason were placed under their guard. They were feared not only by external enemies, but also by the empire's own nobility. Their distinctive Danish axe was so enormous that, according to contemporaries, a Varangian could sever a horse's head with a single blow. The sight of that axe at your gate signaled the end. We see what they did, but we still haven't answered the main question. Why? Put yourself in Basil's shoes. The throne is shaking. You have two options. First, negotiate with your nobility, grant them more power, and forgive traitors. This is the path of compromise. Second, risky, stake everything on 6,000 pagan foreigners who serve only for money. Which risk seems greater to you, betrayal by your own, or the greed of strangers? Basil made his choice. He decided that greed could be measured and satisfied with gold, but the thirst for power and betrayal by one's own could not. But for his gamble to succeed, he needed to transform a monetary contract into an unbreakable oath. The empire found a way to embed its highest interest into their personal code of honor, and this hack proved stronger than the walls of Constantinople. Byzantium did not try to change the nature of the Varangians. It acted like a clever gardener, grafting a new branch onto a wild but strong tree. They hacked their code, replacing abstract loyalty to the empire with the only thing they understood, a personal oath to their chieftain. In their world, the foundation of everything was the druzhina, bound by an oath of loyalty to the konung. Fleeing the battlefield or betraying the chieftain was the worst shame, to be washed away only by death. And here's the twist. The Varangians swore an oath not to the Byzantine Empire but personally to the man on the throne, whom they perceived as the supreme konung, the weapon chief. They served not the state, but a person. This simple conceptual substitution made them deaf to palace intrigues and the offers of usurpers. But an oath alone was not enough. It's easy to be loyal to a winner. But what happened when an emperor lost? When he was overthrown? In such cases, the Byzantine nobility and army massively switched sides to the new ruler. It was a norm of survival. It would seem that mercenaries serving for money should have done the same to keep their contracts. But reality hit hard. The Varangians fought to the last for an emperor who had already lost or was even dead. Their oath was valid until the death of their chief, not until his political defeat. This behavior utterly shocked the Byzantines. The princess historian Anna Komnene wrote that their loyalty was an inherited trait, part of their nature. They did not calculate. They fulfilled a sacred duty. And this leads us to a paradox. The most profitable moment for a guardsman was the death of his emperor. How was iron discipline maintained in a unit composed of Europe's wildest warriors? Formally, there were laws and punishments. The guard had its own commanders who maintained order. But this was an illusion of top-down control. In reality, the main mechanism was not fear of an officer, but the paralyzing shame before comrades. The Guard was a close, insular brotherhood. Losing honor in the eyes of one's peers was worse than any execution. They policed themselves, expelling or killing those who shamed the unit. The empire created ideal conditions, and their cultural code then functioned as the most effective regulator. Traces of this brotherhood are still scratched in runes on the marble of Hagia Sophia. But this honorable brotherhood was also made by the empire into the richest club in the world. Could a code of honor alone keep thousands of pragmatic warriors in service for decades? No. Sagas are full of stories about their love for gold. Wealth was the primary sign of success, and therein lies the genius of the Byzantine system. It didn't pit honor against money, but fused them inextricably. It created conditions where the most honorable path was simultaneously the richest. Betrayal meant losing not only honor, but also access to unthinkable financial flows. The empire created golden handcuffs that the Varangians willingly and proudly put on themselves. Being loyal became incredibly profitable. Gold made them incorruptible, and their greatest prize they received at the empire's most tragic moment. To join the highest-paid military service in the world, one first had to pay a huge gold entrance fee. Why pay for the right to risk your life? It was an elite club, weeding out the poor and casual adventurers. But the reality was more cunning. It wasn't a fee, but an investment. By paying a fortune, which the future king of Norway, Harald Hardrada, saved for 4 years, a guardsman became a shareholder in the ruling emperor. Any rebellion now threatened his personal investment. It was a filter not for wealth, but for motivation. It guaranteed that only the most ambitious warriors, who viewed service as the main business, project of their lives, joined the Guard, and the entrance fee was only a small part of their income. So, how much did their incorruptibility cost? At first glance, the answer is simple: an enormous salary, many times that of a regular Byzantine soldier. But the numbers shatter this simple picture. To the salary were added regular bonuses for church holidays, generous gifts from the emperor and empress, and a share of war spoils. Their total income made them 11th century multimillionaires, wealthier than many aristocrats. This system worked as an inoculation against betrayal. The empire injected such a massive dose of gold into their system that they developed lifelong immunity to any bribery. No conspirator could simply offer them more than they already had by law. But even this paled before their main and most shocking financial privilege. How did Byzantium solve the bodyguard's ultimate problem? What to do when your lord is killed, and you're left without pay or protection? In such a moment, guards either flee or swear allegiance to a new ruler. It's a norm of survival. But Byzantium inverted this logic. At the emperor's death, Varangians received a legal right, known in sagas as pollutusvarf, the plundering of the treasury. They could storm the treasury and take as much gold, jewels, and silks as each could physically carry. This ingenious rule transformed the emperor's death from a career dead end into the ultimate payday. One guardsman could carry up to 36 kilograms of gold, an aristocrat's lifetime income, earned in a single day. This ensured they would defend the ruler to their last breath, for only his official death opened access to the main reward. But how did a rich and loyal guard keep the entire Byzantine elite in fear? Was it merely their status? We've understood their psychology and economics. The mystery seems solved. However, without a demonstration of overwhelming physical force, their status would have been nothing. Their privileges and wealth needed protection. Their authority rested on the knowledge that everyone, from commoner to aristocrat, knew quarreling with a Varangian was mortally dangerous. Their reputation rested on a perfect balance of gold and steel, and if gold bought their loyalty, steel ensured their inviolability. Next, we'll examine the weapon that became the symbol of the Guard, and could, by its mere sight, halt a conspiracy: the legendary Danish axe. The Byzantines officially called them pelakiphoroi, the axe-bearing guard. Not by armor, not by status. Their name became synonymous with their weapon. Why? At first glance, the answer is simple. The Danish axe, or broad axe, was their primary tool: a long ash shaft, a massive blade, a two-handed grip. But the reality is more complex. The 11th century Byzantine historian Michael Sellos wrote that a Varangian could sever a bull's head with a single blow. Such excessive power is not needed for guarding a palace. It was not a tool, but a declaration. The mere sight of a weapon capable of cleaving a horseman and his horse conveyed the absolute power of the emperor and the futility of resistance. But why an axe, and not a more noble sword? The answer lies in the geometry of palace corridors. Why did the elite of elites choose a commoner's weapon? The sword in Byzantium was a symbol of status. The axe was a traditional Viking weapon. It seems to be simply a nod to tradition. But let's move from the battlefield to the narrow corridors of the great palace. The long shaft of the axe allowed a Varangian to control the entire space. One wide swing created a deadly arc that a conspirator with a short sword simply could not enter. An axe attack functioned like a heavy oak door torn from its hinges. A swordsman trying to stop it was doomed. This was not a matter of tradition, but cold tactical calculation, transforming the palace's architecture into an ally. But this tactic worked not only in defense. In open battle, a two-handed weapon makes a warrior vulnerable. But the guard turned this into an advantage. How? Their formation, the shield wall, was perfected. The first row held locked shields, the second struck with axes over this barrier. But chronicles paint a more dramatic picture. On October 18, 1081, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, the guard, consisting mostly of Anglo-Saxons, was the only unit to withstand the charge of Robert Guiscard's elite cavalry. They were thrown into the most desperate points of battle. Their reputation was so great that often their mere appearance on a flank forced the enemy to retreat. This system of honor, money, and steel seemed perfect, but it had a ceiling which only one man managed to break. We've understood how this system worked: 3 pillars, an unbreakable oath, immense gold, and a deadly axe. This triad created the ideal soldier, loyal and invincible. It seemed like the pinnacle of aspirations. But what was a Varangian's career ceiling? Could he become a general? No. The unwavering system had a glass ceiling. He always remained an outsider, a mercenary barbarian. However, history knows one man who not only reached this ceiling but shattered it. He used the guard not as an end goal, but as a tool to achieve the unthinkable, conquering a royal throne. His name became legend, and his journey transformed bodyguard service into the most successful startup of the Viking Age. The name of this startup founder was Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. At 15, he was an exiled prince without a penny or an army. 10 years later, he literally bought himself the Kingdom of Norway. How? First, he had to serve as a mercenary for 4 years to save up for the enormous entrance fee to the guard. For him, it wasn't a career, but a business project. Arriving in Constantinople after his brother's death, he seemed like an ordinary refugee. But he wasn't seeking safety. He sought the bloodiest and most profitable campaigns in Sicily, Bulgaria, the Middle East. Byzantium was his venture fund. He invested his blood to accumulate startup capital for his main endeavor, the throne of Norway. But how to extract such wealth from an empire that never let its best warriors go? The answer lies in the fact that the guard's most successful commander ended up in prison. He became too rich and influential. The new empress, Zoe, accused him of embezzling the treasury. This was a typical Byzantine intrigue, but Harald was no victim. During another palace coup, his men freed him. He stormed the treasury, seized a ship, but his path was blocked by an unbreakable chain across the Golden Horn Bay. He then ordered all his men to run to the stern. The ship's bow lifted clear of the water and skipped over the obstacle. This escape is key to his psychology. His loyalty was absolute as long as the contract was upheld. When the empire broke it, he became a Viking again, for whom his own gold superseded all else. Was his wealth merely a legend from the sagas? Scandinavian chronicles state that he carried away so much gold that no one in the north had seen its like. But here are the cold facts. Arriving in Rus, he hired a huge army. Landing in Norway, he didn't start a war. He showed his treasures to his nephew king and offered a deal, half his wealth in exchange for half the kingdom. The king agreed. Harald bought his throne. This story became living proof. Service in the guard was a path to unthinkable power. It transformed into the main magnet, attracting the best warriors from all over northern Europe. But ironically, it was Harold who set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the Guard. The year 1066. Harold Hardrada, now King of Norway, dies in England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. A few weeks later, the English king who defeated him himself perishes at the Battle of Hastings, annihilated by the Normans, descendants of other Vikings. After this, the ethnic composition of the Guard dramatically changed. Thousands of Anglo-Saxon aristocrats, having lost their lands, flocked en masse to Constantinople. They joined the Varangian Guard, an army of fortune-seekers transformed into an army of exiles. Anglo-Saxons who had lost their homeland to the descendants of Vikings became the core of the Viking Guard. Ahead of them awaited an enemy who would come not from the east, but from the west, under the banner of the cross. This would be their last stand. How could a city that had repelled every siege for 800 years fall at the hands of Christian allies? On April 12, 1204, the army of the Fourth Crusade stormed Constantinople. The Byzantine elite habitually divided power and gold, while Emperor Alexios V simply fled. On the walls, a few hundred Varangians, mostly Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians, fought fiercely. This was the only combat-ready unit, loyal to its oath. But they were too few against 20,000 professional crusaders and an entire city paralyzed by betrayal. Constantinople fell not because its walls were weak, it fell because its soul had rotted. The Varangian Guard was the last healthy organ in the dying body of the empire. When everything you fought for crumbles, what remains for a warrior? Only one final choice. What did the last Varangian feel, gazing at the burning city he had sworn to protect? For many Anglo-Saxons in the Guard's ranks, this was a second lost homeland. The first was taken from them by the descendants of Vikings in England. The second was being burned by the descendants of Franks. In the chaos of 3 days of plunder, amidst the clang of shattered relics in Hagia Sophia, it seemed logical to save one's life. But chronicles conceal another ending. When the emperor fled and the city fell, the guardsmen had a choice: blend into the crowd, surrender, or die. Most chose the latter. They gathered for a final battle at the Blackernay Palace. Their last fight was utterly irrational. It was not for money, which they would no longer be paid, not for the emperor, who had betrayed them. It was for the only thing that remained untouched, their oath. Their bodies fell. But did the Guard itself survive? If the Guard was annihilated, why are there mentions of it up to the 14th century? After the Crusaders were expelled and the empire was restored in 1261, the institution of the Varangian Guard was formally revived. They once again stood guard with axes on their shoulders. But it was merely a shell. The world had changed. The Viking Age had ended. Scandinavia and England had become centralized Christian kingdoms that needed their own soldiers. The flow of desperate warrior adventurers from the north dried up. The Guard was a product of its time, an era of personal loyalty to a chieftain and a constant influx of recruits from the barbarian periphery. When these conditions disappeared, so did its essence. Their story was over. Only the legend remained. So what remained of history's greatest bodyguards after their world burned to ashes? Their loyalty saved neither them nor the empire. Their honor remained untarnished, but they lost. Was their story a lesson in absolute loyalty, an example for centuries? Or is it a tale of the tragic naivety of barbarians, whose code of honor proved useless and destructive in the cynical world of grand politics? This question has no simple answer. Their bodies fell, but their legend did not. To understand what legacy they left behind, we must bring all 7 keys to their code together. In the finale, we will provide the definitive answer to the main enigma, why they were as they were. To unravel the Varangian Guard's code, all 7 keys must be assembled. Their betrayal. Loyalty rested on 3 pillars: the empire's cynical calculation, the ingenious decision of one emperor, and the unbreakable code of the Varangians themselves. The first key, wolves at the gate. Byzantium transformed its fiercest enemies, the Rus, into protectors because it paid more than could be gained through plunder. The second key, Basil II's forge. In a moment of despair, he imported 6,000 foreigners, creating not a guard, but a personal army loyal only to him. The third key, oath of blood. This system worked because Byzantium hacked their cultural code. It offered them a contract that perfectly aligned with their core concept, sacred loyalty to a personal chieftain. This foundation was solid, but upon it, two powerful motivators had to be built: gold and steel. Upon this foundation, Byzantium placed the two most understandable incentives for a mercenary. The fourth key, golden handcuffs. The empire created a system where betrayal was economically pointless. Enormous salaries, constant gifts, and most importantly, the right of pollutus varf, the plundering of the treasury after the emperor's death. This right allowed guardsmen to legally take as much gold from the treasury as they could physically carry. Their greed became the guarantee of their loyalty. The fifth key, dance of the axe. This economic power was protected by military might. Their Danish axe and battle tactics gave them elite status. They were not just soldiers, but a symbol of power that inspired terror. Honor was bolstered by gold, and gold was protected by steel. This system gave rise to its main hero, whose story proved its effectiveness. The perfectly engineered system produced two results: legend and tragedy. The sixth key, the king's path. The story of Harald Hardrada, who rose from mercenary to King of Norway, became a living advertisement for the Guard. It proved that service to the emperor was the fastest route to unthinkable power and wealth. The seventh key, the last stand. The same system, based on a personal oath, proved fragile when the world around it collapsed. Their heroic demise defending Constantinople in 1204 showed both the strength of their code and its vulnerability in a world of total betrayal. So why were they as they were? Because Byzantium created a unique ecosystem. It took their innate code of honor and placed it in ideal conditions, amplified by immense money, reinforced by elite status, and proven by success stories. Their loyalty was not a miracle. It was a brilliantly engineered mechanism. We have dissected this mechanism. But what was its mainspring? On the one hand, their final battle in the burning city, fighting for a lost cause with no hope of reward, proves their honor and oath were paramount. It was a pure act of loyalty to their code. On the other hand, the entire system was built on gold. Harald's story, the right to plunder the treasury, and their incredible wealth scream that money was the main driving force that attracted them to service. We have shown you both sides of the coin, but what ultimately proved stronger, their barbarian honor or Byzantine gold? Consider which held greater sway.